often do we stand in the pulpit and preach a text that is causing one or more of our hearers unbearable pain? Over the course of my studies here at Vanderbilt, I've come to be acutely aware that the meditations of my heart and the words from my mouth do not always convey the passionate love that I have for God and God's children. I know what I mean, so when I preach a certain text, I strive to convey that meaning to the congregation, but sometimes, maybe always, in spite of my effort, there are those for whom such wounds exist that my words cannot heal them, cannot even offer triage. Our text for today is one of those texts that can be problematic for many people. Starting with the title alone as it appears in many Bibles, regardless of translation, A Sinful Woman Forgiven. There are spaces in this text that are difficult for even the most faithful churchgoer. How then are these words received by those outside of the church? How is a title such as this received by a woman whom the church has wounded? What does this text have to offer us or those who hear it for the first time? Maybe the answer is nothing. Or maybe the answer lies in how we who take on the mantle of responsibility for speaking from the pulpit engage this type of text. When I met with a couple of women to look at this text, the first question that came up was, why is the sinner in this story a woman? Why does the sinner in stories in the Bible often seem to be a woman? Is this the result of God's divine plan for women? Or is this the result of male authors? To be fair, the Bible is probably equally full of male sinners as well. Certainly there are plenty of stories that feature male sinners that we can point to. Cain, Jacob, Joseph's brothers. In the New Testament, Zacchaeus, and perhaps the two best-known sinners in the New Testament, Peter and Paul. But when we preach this text and other texts that name women as sinful, we must be careful to point out that there are stories of male sinners in the Bible. We must be careful to note that Paul, who tormented Christians before his conversion, recognized and stated that all have sinned and fall short. And in this particular text, we must recognize that of the three people we meet, Jesus, Simon, and this unnamed woman, she is the focus of Jesus' forgiveness and the locus of power in this story. The very fact that she is a woman and a prostitute on the most extreme margins of society then and now makes her appearance in Simon's home and her care of Jesus remarkable. The inclusion of her story in the Gospels, not just in the Gospel of Luke, but in all four Gospels, speaks of her importance even now. As the body of Christ, this story should always remind us that we are the eternal retellers of Christ's story. We are the mediators through which God's message of love is received by a broken world. How we represent God's love speaks much more loudly than what we say or even what we believe about the gospel message. My dear friend told me the story of her mother, repeatedly abused physically, verbally, and sexually by her father. When her mother, as a 9-year-old child, went to the priest, went to the church for help, for refuge, she was returned to her father immediately so that he could deal with her. Not only was she denied refuge, she was returned to her tormentor. Is it any wonder that my friend has difficulty understanding God's love for her? Is it any wonder that a story entitled A Sinful Woman Forgiven causes her anger and pain rather than speaking of love and healing into her life? I'm reminded of the song that I sang with my children when they were little. Be careful, little mouth, what you say. Oh, be careful, little mouth, what you say. For the Father up above is looking down in love. So be careful, little mouth, what you say. We cannot change what is written in the Bible, but we can be very careful that our little mouths speak of God's great love and our actions confirm what our mouths are saying. This text can be read in such a way as to put forth a disturbing question. Does Jesus forgive this woman because she offers him all she has? The text could seem to point in that direction. Jesus' parable about the creditor who forgives the debtor's debts can seem to imply that those who are in greater need of forgiveness appreciate that forgiveness all the more. A deeper look, though, reveals that Jesus is making a much more nuanced point in this story. Jesus is recognizing that those who recognize their own sin are often more willing to humble themselves before God and seek forgiveness. Their actions don't secure God's forgiveness because God forgives all of us before we are even able to recognize that we need forgiveness. And like the creditor in Jesus' parable, God forgives our sin regardless of its amount, its depth, or its breadth. But the person who hears this text for the first time might want to push back against a parable and a larger text that seem to be saying there's a hierarchy of sins, and that bigger sin or more sin deserves and receives more forgiveness. We who speak from the pulpit then bear the responsibility of pointing out that Jesus is not speaking to the woman. Jesus is speaking to Simon. And with Simon as a dialogue partner, Jesus' words take on a totally different meaning. As one commentator says, Simon was conscious of no need and therefore felt no love and so received no forgiveness. Simon's impression of himself was that he was a good man in the sight of men and God. On the other hand, the woman was conscious of nothing other than a demanding need, and therefore was overwhelmed with love for him who could supply it, and so received forgiveness. She did not ask for forgiveness, but she recognized a need to be reconciled with God, and so she received forgiveness. At the heart of this text lies another crucial theme, the theme of radical hospitality. The woman with the least to offer shows the most radical hospitality in this story. She tends to Jesus' needs. She cares for him in a radical way. She loves him in spite of her seemingly unlovable state. The host in this story, by contrast, fails miserably at hospitality. He doesn't offer Jesus even the barest of expected comforts that should be offered to a guest, and on top of that, he singles his guest out for censure. And in the process of doing so, he bars from the table anyone who doesn't measure up to his exacting standards. Are we welcoming all of those who, like this woman, yearn for God's presence on some deep level? Or are we erecting barriers that keep them from God's table? There's a story about a little boy, ragged, filthy, living in despair, who sees the light from a large, beautiful church spilling into the street. He's cold, he's hungry, he has no place to go. He's hopeless. And so he goes to the doors of the big, beautiful church, and when he gets close, he hears beautiful music spilling out. And he pauses, and then he draws up his courage, and he opens the doors, and he goes in, and it's so warm inside, and it's so beautiful. It's so different from anything he knows. So he proceeds into the big room where the people are singing. This place is so compelling. Something, he really doesn't know what, draws him down the aisle toward the kindly woman who stands up in the front in the pretty white robe. And as people begin to notice him, and as his quite unlovely scent begins to reach them, they lean away from the center aisle, and their faces wrinkle with distaste. The little boy continues his journey toward the front, and when he gets to the front, there's an empty spot, and he sits down on the front pew right next to a young man and woman, well-dressed, handsome couple. They look just like the picture-perfect image he has in his mind of what Mom and Dad would look like. So he sits down next to them, but they shy away too. And they scooch further down the pew so they won't have to sit next to him, so they won't have to smell him. And the little boy is almost in tears. And he's looking down, and he's preparing to get up and leave, because this isn't the place that he thought it was, when he realizes that the space beside him has been filled. And he turns to look, and the woman in the pretty white robe is sitting right next to him in the space vacated by the couple. And despite the fact that he's dirty, and despite the fact that he smells, she puts her arm around him, and she leans into his little face, and she says, "I am so glad that you are here." Are we opening a place at God's table? Are we like the parishioners in this story, or are we like the woman in the white robe? Are we inviting all to join us, or are we hosting a banquet only for those that look and think and act just like us? We speak for God from this pulpit. We represent Christ in this world. So does the world hear from us a message of love and healing, or does the world hear that only certain people are welcome at God's table? Be careful, little mouth, what you say. Amen.